I never imagined that a man would confess in court to having destroyed his own family, and that I would have to decide what to do with that truth. I am Judge Angela Thompson, 44 years old, Atlanta, Georgia. I have been on the bench for almost 15 years and have seen it all. Messy divorces, custody battles, broken families. But what happened that Tuesday in March in my courtroom that kept me up at night for months? What started as a routine custody case turned into a bomb that exploded right before my eyes. And I had to clean up the debris. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can know how far it has reached. The case file read, Morrison versus Morrison. Divorce, custody of 2 minors. The usual. He was David Morrison, 38, software engineer. She, Claire Morrison, 36, nurse. 2 children, Emma, 9, and Lucas, 6. On paper, it was simple. Claire was seeking full custody, claiming David was an absent father, workaholic, emotionally distant. David claimed Claire was alienating him from the children out of revenge after the divorce. I see cases like this 3 times a week. The first hearing was normal. Claire was crying, David serious and controlled. The lawyers saying the usual. My client is the best father in the world. My client is the only one who has truly cared for the children. Blah, blah, blah. I was taking notes, looking at the social workers' reports, evaluating what would be best for the children. Because in the end, that is the only thing that matters in these cases. The children. But something didn't add up. Claire was nervous. Too nervous. Not the typical nerves of someone facing a custody trial. It was something else. Her hands trembled when David's lawyer asked questions. She avoided looking at a certain part of the room, and David had a strange expression. It wasn't anger. It was like guilt, fear. I couldn't identify it. Then David's mother came to testify. Margaret Morrison, 67, a proper lady, navy blue dress, pearl necklace, straight back. She came to testify in favor of her son. Said David was a wonderful father, always responsible, and Claire was manipulating the situation. The usual things a mother-in-law says in these cases. But when Claire's lawyer began to cross-examine her, things changed. Mrs. Morrison, how often do you see your grandchildren? About every 2 weeks. And where do you usually see them? At my house or at my son's house? Never at Claire's house? Silence. Margaret pressed her lips together. Answer the question, Mrs. Morrison, I said. No. Claire hasn't allowed me into her home for 2 years. And do you know why? Another silence. This one longer. Margaret looked at her son. David had his head down, his knuckles white from clenching his fists. Mrs. Morrison, answer. There was. A misunderstanding. Claire's lawyer didn't let it go. A misunderstanding? Or was it? Because you called social services accusing my client of child abuse without any proof? Boom. The courtroom went silent. Margaret turned red. I had reasons to be concerned. What reasons? The investigation found no evidence of abuse. Why would you do that? And then it happened. David suddenly stood up. His chair scraped horribly against the floor. Enough! That's enough! His lawyer tried to calm him. Mr. Morrison, please. No. I can't continue with this. He turned toward me. Your Honor, I need to say something. My assistant looked at me worried. This wasn't protocol, but something in David's eyes told me I had to listen. Go ahead, Mr. Morrison. But I warn you, everything you say will be recorded. David took a deep breath. His hands trembled. My mother didn't make that call to social services. I did. The silence that followed was absolute. Claire's mouth dropped open. Her lawyer dropped her pen. Margaret closed her eyes. Continue, I said. 2 years ago, Claire and I were going through our divorce. She wanted me to see the kids less. I was furious, desperate. My mother told me that if there was any indication that Claire wasn't taking good care of them, I could get more custody time. So, I made things up. I called anonymously and reported that the children came to school dirty, that Emma had said her mother left her home alone, that there were bruises. All lies. Claire started crying, not from sadness, from anger. Investigators came to my house, she said through sobs. They searched everything. They spoke to my kids. They scared them. Emma had nightmares for weeks, and all of it was a lie? David wasn't looking at her. I'm sorry. I was desperate. I thought if... You thought what? Claire stood up. Did you think ruining my reputation, traumatizing our children, making me look like a bad mother would get you more time with them? Is that what you thought? I had to bang the gavel. Order. Mrs. Morrison, please sit down. Mr. Morrison, as well. But David wasn't done. There's more, he said, his voice almost a whisper. The reason Emma has been so distant from me, Claire thinks it's because I spend too much time working. But it's not that. David, no. Margaret's voice was pleading. Emma heard me. 6 months ago, when she stayed over for the weekend, I was on the phone with my mother. I was telling her I was the one who made the false report. Emma was awake. She heard everything. And since then, she doesn't talk to me the same. She looks at me differently. I leaned back in my chair. This was a disaster, an absolute disaster. Claire was crying uncontrollably. Her lawyer tried to comfort her. David's lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. Margaret had her face in her hands. I called a 30-minute recess. I needed to think. In my office, I reviewed the entire file, the social services report from 2 years ago, the investigation notes, the interviews with the children. Everything had come back clean. Claire was a good mother. Always had been. And David had weaponized the system. That is a crime. Making false reports to social services is a crime. I could refer the case to the prosecutor. David could face charges. But there are the children, Emma and Lucas, already traumatized by the divorce, by the false investigation, by family tensions. What would seeing their father arrested do to them? Prosecuted? I returned to the courtroom. Everyone was silent, waiting. Mr. Morrison, what you have confessed here is extremely serious. Making false reports to Child Protective Services is not only illegal, it is a betrayal of the trust placed in a system designed to protect children who are truly in danger. You wasted resources, traumatized your family, and used your own children as pawns. David nodded, tears running down his face. That said, I must make a decision considering the well-being of Emma and Lucas. They have already suffered enough. Claire was staring at me intently. I award primary custody to Mrs. Claire Morrison. Mr. David Morrison will have supervised visitation for 6 months, after which it will be evaluated whether he may have unsupervised visits. Mr. Morrison must attend individual and family therapy with a court-approved professional. I paused. Additionally, I am referring this case to the district attorney to determine whether charges for the false report should be filed. However, I will recommend that, given Mr. Morrison's voluntary confession and considering the impact on the minors, a diversion program be considered instead of full criminal prosecution, provided Mr. Morrison completes community service, intensive therapy, and pays all of Mrs. Morrison's legal costs related to the social services investigation. David closed his eyes, nodded. And Mr. Morrison, if you use the legal system again for personal revenge, if you put your children in the middle of your adult problems again, there will be no second chance. Do you understand me? Yes, Your Honor. Claire was still crying, but now breathing more calmly. Her lawyer squeezed her hand. That case closed 3 years ago. I later learned that David completed everything. The therapy, community service, everything. The prosecutor accepted my recommendation and did not file formal charges. Emma began therapy as well. Gradually, her relationship with her father improved. It never went back to what it was, but it improved. Claire wrote me a letter a year later. She thanked me for listening, for protecting her children, for not making the process more painful than it needed to be. But David also wrote me. He said that confession in court was the hardest thing he had ever done, but it was necessary. He couldn't keep lying, seeing how his daughter looked at him, knowing the truth. He needed everything to come out, even if it destroyed him. Sometimes justice is not about punishment. It's about doing what's right for everyone involved, especially for those who have no voice of their own. Those children didn't deserve more trauma. They deserve the adults in their lives to finally act like adults. And that is my most unforgettable sentence. Not because it was the most legally complex, but because it reminded me why I do this. Why I sit on that bench day after day listening to families destroy each other. Because sometimes one person has the courage to tell the truth, and someone has to be there to listen and decide what to do with that truth. That time, that person was me. I remember perfectly that October morning when I arrived at the courthouse with the feeling that it would be just another day in my long career as a judge. I had reviewed the case the night before, a matter that on paper seemed relatively straightforward, a custody dispute over 2 minors between divorced parents with some disagreements about the division of assets. Margaret and Robert. Chambers had been married for 17 years before she filed for divorce. He was an accountant at a prestigious firm. She had left her career as a nurse to raise their children, Emma, 14, and Lucas, 11. The preliminary statements showed the typical pattern of mutual reproaches, accusations of emotional neglect, irreconcilable differences. Nothing I hadn't seen hundreds of times before in my courtroom. When I entered the courtroom that morning, it was already full. Families usually bring a whole entourage of moral witnesses, and the chambers were no exception. I observed Margaret sitting next to her lawyer, an impeccable woman in a navy blue suit who was taking notes incessantly. Margaret looked tired, with deep dark circles that makeup didn't quite conceal. Her hands were clasped on the table, knuckles white from the pressure. On the other side, Robert seemed more composed, although I detected an almost imperceptible tremor in his right leg, that nervousness people think they can hide, but that always manifests in some way. What caught my attention was the presence of Robert's mother, an older woman with perfectly styled gray hair, sitting in the front row with a severe expression. Next to her was Margaret's sister, holding a pack of tissues as if preparing for an emotional battle. I could feel the tension in the air, that particular electricity that precedes family storms in court. We began with the standard testimonies. Robert's lawyer presented evidence that Margaret had shown erratic behavior in recent months, inexplicable late nights, neglect of the children's routines. They had statements from neighbors, school records showing that Emma had been late several times. Margaret's lawyer countered with proof that Robert constantly worked late, had missed important events for the children, and that his priority had always been his career over his family. It was the usual ping-pong of blame, each side painting the other as the villain, while portraying themselves as misunderstood victims. But then came the moment that changed everything. I called Margaret to testify, and when she stood up, I noticed something different in her expression. It was no longer the tired, resigned look from before. There was determination there, mixed with something I couldn't immediately identify, perhaps terror or maybe premature release. She walked to the stand with measured steps, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. Her lawyer began with routine questions about her role as a mother, her dedication to the children, her version of the events leading to the divorce. Margaret answered in a clear but monotone voice, as if reciting lines she had rehearsed 1,000 times. Her lawyer looked satisfied, nodding with every answer that strengthened her case. We were about to move on to cross-examination when Margaret did something completely unexpected. She interrupted her own lawyer in the middle of a question and turned directly to me. "Your Honor," she said in a voice that suddenly sounded different, firmer, almost defiant. "I need to say something that isn't in any of these documents. Something I should have said from the beginning but didn't have the courage to." Her lawyer immediately stiffened, raising a hand in a warning gesture that Margaret completely ignored. Robert's lawyer leaned forward, clearly intrigued. I maintained my neutral expression, although my instinct told me we were about to enter dangerous territory. "Go ahead, Mrs. Chambers," I said, keeping my tone professional but allowing her to continue. In all my years as a judge, I had learned that when someone feels that urgent need to confess something, stopping them only prolongs the inevitable. Margaret took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the stand. "Lucas is not Robert's son," she said, and those 6 words fell across the room like a fragmentation bomb. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see. Robert turned pale, his mouth slightly open in shock. His lawyer dropped the pen he was holding. Robert's mother brought a hand to her chest as if she had just received a physical blow. Margaret's sister let out a stifled cry. 12 years ago, I had an affair," Margaret continued, and now the words flowed from her as if a dam had broken. "It lasted 6 months. When I found out I was pregnant, the relationship was already over. I never told that man that Lucas existed. Robert and I were going through a good phase then, So I just let him believe he was the father. And he was in every way that matters. He was the one who was at the birth, who stayed up those first nights, who taught him to ride a bike. Margaret's voice cracked slightly, but she recovered. But I cannot keep living with this lie. I can't be here fighting for Lucas's custody using that deception as a basis. Robert has been his father in every way except biology, and he deserves to know the truth. The chaos that followed was immediate. Robert's lawyer stood up demanding a recess. Margaret's lawyer looked like she wanted to disappear under the table. Margaret's sister began to cry openly. Robert's mother rose and stormed out of the room. And Robert? Robert simply sat there, staring at Margaret as if he had never seen her before. I struck the gavel demanding order, feeling how the simple case I had anticipated that morning was turning into something infinitely more complex and painful. This confession not only changed the legal terms of the divorce, but shattered the emotional structure of an entire family. I had to call a 30-minute recess because the situation had become impossible to manage. As I watched everyone leave the room, each lost in their own state of shock, I remained seated on my bench, processing what I had just witnessed. In my 21 years as a judge, I had seen dramatic confessions, last-minute revelations, plot twists that completely changed cases. But this was different. Margaret had not confessed to gain a legal advantage. Quite the opposite. She had triggered a bomb that would destroy any possibility of an amicable resolution and also put her in an incredibly vulnerable legal position. When we returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had completely changed. Robert entered with red eyes. He had clearly been crying during the recess. His lawyer walked alongside him with an expression that mixed professional anger and genuine compassion for his client. Margaret returned to her seat with her head held high, but I noticed her hands trembling as she placed them on the table. Her lawyer had adopted that tense expression attorneys wear when they know their client has just completely sabotaged their own case, but must carry on anyway. What happened next was one of the most difficult moments I have had to witness in my career. Robert's lawyer asked to speak and, with a controlled but clearly affected voice, requested that his client be called to testify. Robert approached the bench with mechanical movements, as if his body was functioning on autopilot while his mind tried to process the devastation he had just received. He swore to tell the truth in a barely audible voice. His lawyer began with direct questions about his relationship with Lucas, and that's when I witnessed something that still moves me when I remember it. Robert began to talk about his son, about the boy he had believed was his for 11 years, and despite the betrayal he had just discovered, despite the evident pain in every word, there was genuine and unwavering love in his voice. He described how he had been present in every stage of Lucas's life, from his first steps to the nights helping him with homework. He spoke of soccer games, family vacations, the nighttime fears only he could soothe. And as he spoke, tears streamed down his face with no effort to hide them. "That boy is my son," he finally said, looking directly at Margaret with a mixture of pain and determination that was heartbreaking to witness. "No matter what a DNA test says, I am his father. I'm the only father he's ever known. And even though Margaret lied to me for 11 years, even though she built our family on a falsehood, that doesn't change what Lucas means to me." It was at that moment I realized the true complexity of the case I was handling. This was no longer simply a standard custody dispute. It was a question involving the very definition of fatherhood, of family, of what it means to be a father beyond genetics. And my decision would not only affect the legal aspects, but would have deep emotional ramifications for everyone involved, especially for two children who had not asked to be at the center of this storm. I decided to call Emma, the older daughter, to testify. She was 14, old enough for her testimony to carry weight in custody considerations. When she entered the room, I saw she was a serious teenager with her mother's eyes, but something in her manner of walking that reminded me of Robert. She sat on the stand with her back straight, trying to appear more grown-up than she really was, that defense mechanism children adopt when forced to mature too quickly. I asked her gentle questions about her family life, her relationship with both parents, how the divorce process had been for her. She answered carefully, weighing every word, clearly terrified of saying something that might hurt either parent. But when I asked about Lucas, her carefully constructed composure began to crack. "My brother doesn't know about this, does he?" she suddenly asked, her voice rising with panic. "Please tell me Lucas wasn't in the room when Mom said that." I hurried to assure her that both children had been kept out of the room for all proceedings, that Lucas was with a social worker elsewhere in the building. The visible relief on her face was immediate, but then came something else, a deep sadness no 14-year-old should have to carry. "They can't tell him," she pleaded, looking me directly in the eyes with desperate intensity. "Lucas adores Dad. Dad is his hero. If he finds out about this, it will destroy him. He wouldn't understand. He's only 11. Tears began to fall down her face. "It's already hard enough that our parents are getting divorced. He's been crying every night for months. Now does he also have to lose his father? Or think that his father might not want him anymore?" Her lawyer tried to intervene, but Emma continued, words now pouring out in torrents. "Dad is the one who takes him to practice every Saturday. Dad is the one who made up that funny voice to read him bedtime stories. When Lucas had nightmares about monsters, it was Dad who checked under his bed every night for 2 months until he felt safe again. Mom is great too. I love them both, but Lucas and Dad have something special. They always have." I had to pause at that moment because the emotion in the room was overwhelming. I saw Margaret sobbing quietly in her seat, her sister wrapping an arm around her. Robert had his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Even the lawyers, seasoned professionals accustomed to family dramas, seemed affected. And I, who pride myself on always maintaining judicial composure, had to take a moment to gather myself. This case had evolved from a legal dispute into a human tragedy within hours. A confession intended to ease Margaret's conscience had opened wounds that might never fully heal, and I was in the position of having to make decisions that would alter the course of these lives forever, especially that of an 11-year-old boy who, at that moment, was unaware that his whole world was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. After Emma's devastating testimony, I knew I needed to understand the full situation before making any decision. I requested that the social workers' report, who had been conducting evaluations of both homes, be presented to the court. Sarah Mitchell, a veteran with nearly 20 years of experience in family services, approached the stand with a thick folder full of observations and notes. What she shared only added more layers of complexity to an already extraordinarily difficult situation. According to her report, both homes were suitable for the children. Margaret had established a stable apartment. The children had their own rooms, and she maintained a steady job as a nurse with hours that allowed her to be present after school. Robert had remained in the family home, maintaining the stability of the environment the children had always known. But what Sarah emphasized, and what disturbed me deeply, was her observation about Lucas specifically. During my visits to the paternal home, Sarah explained carefully, "I observed an extraordinary connection between Mr. Hensley and Lucas. It's not just affection, Your Honor. It's a complete and deeply rooted father-son bond. Lucas seeks his father for validation, comfort, guidance. On one of my visits, Lucas had a bad day at school, problems with some classmates who teased him. He didn't call his mother, even though she was available. He waited 2 hours until his father came home from work because, in his own words, Dad always knows what to say to make me feel better." Sarah paused, consulting her notes before continuing. "I also observed something that seemed significant to me. Lucas has a photo next to his bed. It's of him and his father on a fishing trip last year. Every night, before going to sleep, he touches that photo and says, 'Good night, Dad,' even if Mr. Hensley is in the next room. When I asked him about this, he told me it was his way of making sure Dad knew he was his favorite person in the whole world." I saw Robert close his eyes tightly, more tears escaping down his cheeks. Margaret seemed to be holding back sobs, her face contorted in an expression of almost physical pain. And I, sitting at my bench with the weight of my robe and the responsibility of my position, felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was at stake. Sarah wasn't finished. "Your Honor, I must mention something else. During my evaluation, I asked Lucas a hypothetical question, part of the standard protocol. I asked him if he had to choose one person in the world to be with him if he felt scared or sad, who would it be? Without hesitation or a second's doubt, he answered, 'My dad.' I asked why, and his response was, I quote verbatim, 'Because Dad always protects me. He says I'm his favorite superhero and that he would never leave me alone. He promised he would always be there for me, no matter what.'" The silence that followed this statement was absolute. Everyone in that room understood the cruel irony of that child's words, A promise made in love and good faith, now questioned by a biological truth that none of those involved had asked for. I realized that any decision I made had the potential to shatter that child's faith in promises, in security, in love itself. It was then that Margaret's lawyer requested a private moment with her client. I granted a brief recess of 15 minutes, and when we returned, something fundamental had changed. Margaret stood up without anyone calling her, her attorney beside her with a look of professional resignation. "Your Honor," Margaret began with a trembling but clear voice, "I need to say something else. I need to explain why I revealed the truth about Lucas, why now, and why in this way." She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table in front of her. "For 11 years I have lived with this lie. Every time I saw Robert with Lucas, every time I saw them laugh together or play, I felt the weight of what I had done. I thought I was protecting him, protecting all of us, keeping the family intact, but guilt has been consuming me alive." Her voice broke, but she continued. "When Robert filed for divorce, when he fell in love with someone else, something inside me broke. It wasn't just the end of our marriage. It was realizing that I had sacrificed my peace of mind, my integrity, my honesty, all to keep this family united, and still it was not enough. The family was falling apart anyway, and I thought, stupidly thought, that if I confessed the truth, somehow I would be free, that I could finally breathe without the weight of this lie." Tears now ran freely down her face, but I realized, too late, that by freeing myself, I condemned everyone else. I condemned Robert to question 11 years of fatherhood. I condemned Emma to carry a terrible secret about her brother. And worst of all, I endangered the bond between Lucas and the only father he has ever known. She turned to Robert, her voice completely breaking. "I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I was selfish and cruel, and there is no excuse enough for what I have done." Robert looked at her with an expression I could not fully decipher. There was pain there, undoubtedly, but also something else. Perhaps the recognition of his own imperfect humanity, his own role in the marriage's collapse. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse but firm. "Margaret and I made mistakes, many mistakes. Our marriage fell apart for reasons far beyond this revelation. But there is one thing I need to make absolutely clear." He stood up, looking directly at me. "Lucas is my son. I don't care what any blood test says. I have been his father since the day he was born. I've been there for every important moment and every ordinary moment. And I'm going to keep being his father, if this court allows me, until the day I die." It was at that moment that I understood the true nature of the challenge I faced. I was not simply deciding custody or visitation rights. I was defining what it meant to be family, what constituted fatherhood, and how to protect an innocent child from the collapse of the adult world around him. I ordered another recess, this time for an hour. I needed time to think, to consult legal precedents, to face the enormity of what I was about to decide. In my office, surrounded by legal codes and case law books, I realized that no legal text could truly guide me through this moral crossroads. The law was clear in many aspects. Biology was not the only determining factor in custody matters. The best interest of the child must prevail. But what was really Lucas's best interest in this impossible situation? I thought of my own daughter, who was almost the same age as Lucas when her father and I divorced. I remembered how devastated she was by the breakup, how she struggled to understand why Dad no longer lived at home. And that was with a relatively amicable divorce, without explosive secrets or revelations that shook the foundations of her identity. I couldn't imagine adding to that pain the uncertainty about who her real father was. When we returned to the courtroom, I noticed the tension had subtly shifted. Margaret and Robert had been talking during the recess, their lawyers present but allowing them some privacy. They seemed to have reached some kind of tacit understanding, although the pain on their faces remained unchanged. Before giving my ruling, I made an unorthodox decision. I asked for Lucas to be brought to my office, just him and me, with a child counselor present. I needed to look him in the eyes, hear his voice, understand directly what this child, who had become the center of a storm he neither deserved nor understood needed. Lucas entered my office with the caution typical of an 11-year-old facing an authority figure in an intimidating setting. He was an ordinary-looking boy, with messy brown hair and curious eyes that immediately reminded me of Robert. Although, I wondered with a shiver, was he really similar, or just a projection of 11 years assuming kinship? "Hello, Lucas," I began in the softest voice I could manage. "I know all this has been very confusing and probably a little scary. I'm not going to ask you difficult questions or make you choose between your parents. I just want to know how you feel." The boy looked at me with a maturity he shouldn't have had to develop. "Is this going to break up my family?" he asked directly, with devastating simplicity. "I'm trying to do what's best for everyone, especially you and your sister," I answered honestly. "Can you tell me what's most important to you right now?" Lucas glanced briefly at the counselor, then back at me. "I just want things to go back to how they were before. I want Mom and Dad to be together. I want Emma not to be sad all the time. I want us to stop coming to this place." His lower lip quivered slightly, but he kept his composure. "But Mom says sometimes things can't go back to how they were, that sometimes we have to be brave and accept changes." "Your mom is right about that," I said softly. "And your dad? How do you feel about him?" The transformation in Lucas's face was immediate and complete. His eyes lit up in a way no child could fake. "Dad is the best. He teaches me things, like how to fix broken stuff and how to fish. He helps me with math homework even though he says fractions confuse him, too." A small smile appeared on his face. "He told me no matter what happens, I'll always be his son. Is that true? Can I keep being his son?" I felt a lump in my throat. "Do you want to be?" "Of course," Lucas answered as if it were the silliest question in the world. "He's my dad." After Lucas left, I sat in the silence of my office for several more minutes. That child had articulated in a simple statement what volumes of legal theory could not. Family was not defined by genetics, but by love, constant presence, and the fulfilled promise of protection and care. When I returned to the courtroom, I knew what I had to do. My decision would not make everyone happy, probably wouldn't make anyone completely happy, but it would protect what was most important, the emotional well-being of two children who had already endured too much. I began my ruling by first establishing the legal facts. I ordered a paternity test, not to determine rights, but to establish a complete medical record for Lucas, something that could be crucial for his health in the future. But I made it clear that, regardless of the results, Robert Hensley would be legally recognized as Lucas's father in every sense. 11 years of active, loving, and committed fatherhood established legal bonds that no DNA test could break. Regarding custody, I ordered a shared arrangement with some important specifications. For the first year, while everyone adjusted to this new reality, Lucas would spend the school weeks with Robert, maintaining the stability of his routine and family home. Weekends would alternate between both parents. Emma, whose views I considered due to her age and maturity, would choose her own arrangement within reasonable parameters, with mandatory family therapy recommended for all. But there was one more condition, one that made both parents straighten in their seats. I ordered that Lucas not be informed of the biological circumstances of his birth until he was at least 16 years old, and only then if all professionals involved in his care deemed it appropriate. Margaret and Robert would have to attend joint therapy to learn to co-parent effectively and process their own trauma without involving the children. "This information," I declared firmly, "is a burden that the adults in this room must carry, not an 11-year-old child who did nothing to deserve it. Lucas Hensley has the right to his childhood, to his innocence, to the security of knowing who he is, without his identity being questioned. When he is older, when he has the emotional tools to process this information, then and only then will he be able to decide what it means to him." I saw relief flood Robert's face, followed almost immediately by renewed tears. Margaret nodded slowly, accepting this consequence of her actions. Emma, sitting between them, took both her parents' hands, and at that moment I saw the beginning of possible healing. I closed the session with words I rarely utter from the bench, words that came more from my heart as a mother than from my mind as a judge. I told them the love they clearly felt for their children was evident and real, that the mistakes made were born from human pain, not malice, and that they had the opportunity to show Emma and Lucas that even when families change shape, love does not have to diminish. Several months after that day in court, I received something I never expected: a handwritten letter on notebook paper with the careful handwriting of a child. It was from Lucas. In it, he told me that things were better, that although it was strange to have two homes now, at least Mom and Dad didn't argue as much anymore. He drew me a small heart at the end and signed it, "Your friend, Lucas." I kept that letter in the top drawer of my desk, where it still remains today, a reminder that sometimes the hardest decisions are the most important. But the story didn't end there, as these stories never really do. 6 months after the trial, Margaret requested a private meeting in my office. She arrived alone, without a lawyer, looking much more serene than the last time I saw her. She told me that she had continued with individual therapy, that she was rebuilding her life step by step. She had met someone new, someone who knew her whole story and accepted her anyway. But that wasn't why she had come. She handed me a manila envelope. Inside were documents from a genetic testing lab. She had done the tests on her own. She needed to know the truth with certainty. The results confirmed what we had already suspected. Robert was not Lucas's biological father. I saw the internal struggle in her eyes as she showed me those papers. She asked if it changed anything, if she should present them formally in court. I reminded her of my decision. Biology does not define fatherhood when there are 11 years of unconditional love as evidence. I suggested she keep those documents for the future, for when Lucas is old enough, if he ever needs to know. She nodded, visibly relieved not to have to carry that burden alone. What impacted me most about that meeting was what she said before leaving. "Judge Thompson," she began in a trembling voice, "for years I convinced myself that my secret was to protect my family, to protect Lucas from a painful truth. But now I understand that I was protecting myself from judgment, from the consequences of my decisions. You forced me to face that, and although it was the most painful process of my life, it was necessary. Thank you for not letting my cowardice define my son's future." I will never forget the dignity with which she walked out of my office that day, a woman transformed by the weight of her own actions. Robert also kept me informed through occasional updates his lawyer submitted as required. The family therapy sessions were working. Emma had begun to open up again, and although there were difficult moments, the family was finding a new normal. The most remarkable was a report from the therapist indicating that Robert had achieved something extraordinary. He had completely forgiven Margaret, not for her, but for the sake of their children. He had understood that resentment would be poison for everyone. There was a particularly emotional moment during one of the follow-up hearings. Emma, who was now 14, asked to speak directly to me. With a maturity that took my breath away, she explained that she had been researching non-traditional families for a school project. She told me that she learned love has no grayness, single form, that families can break and rebuild in different ways. "What you did that day," she said, looking me straight in the eye, "was save us from ourselves. You gave my brother the chance to be a child just a little longer. And you gave my parents the chance to remember that they once loved each other enough to create our family. That matters." This case changed something fundamental in me as a judge. For years, I had operated under the belief that my job was to apply the law impartially, that emotions had no place in the courtroom. But Lucas Hensley taught me that true justice requires more than the mere application of legal codes. It requires compassion. It requires understanding that behind every case are real human beings whose lives will be affected by every word we utter from the bench. Now, when I face similar cases, and believe me, they come more often than we'd like to admit, I think of that 11-year-old boy asking me if he could still be his dad's son. I think about how the truth, though important, sometimes needs to be administered with the same care a doctor uses to dose a powerful medicine. Too soon, in the wrong dose, and it can do more harm than good. The last update I received was just 3 months ago. Lucas is now 14, Emma 17. Both are thriving academically. Margaret married her new partner, and they are expecting a baby. Robert began a serious relationship with someone who, I was informed, the kids adore. The two families even spent last Christmas together, a joint celebration that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. But what gives me deep satisfaction is knowing that Lucas still doesn't know the secret of his birth. He is still simply Lucas Hensley, beloved son of Robert, protective brother to Emma, a sophomore in high school with a passion for baseball and math. When he turns 16, the adults in his life will assess if it is the right time. But for now, we gave him what every child deserves: the freedom to grow up without carrying the mistakes of the adults. Sometimes, on quiet nights after difficult days in court, I take that letter from Lucas out of my drawer. I read his simple words, look at that little heart drawn with crayon, and remind myself why I do this job. It's not for the legal precedents we set or the technically perfect sentences we pronounce. It's for moments like that, when justice and mercy meet. When we can use our power not only to resolve disputes but to protect innocence, to preserve love amid chaos. This ruling will haunt me always, but not as a burden, rather as a light. It taught me that being a judge means being wise, not just informed. It means understanding that some truths can wait, that some secrets are kept not out of cowardice, but out of love, and that at the end of the day, the only thing that truly matters is the well-being of the children who trust that adults will make the right decisions, even when those decisions break our hearts.